This one's called 6 Reasons I Love Living in America's Midwest. Pretty interesting because this is a Brit's perspective on living in the USA. Myself, I've never had too much of an interest in actually living in the States. I'd love to visit, but so yeah, it'll be interesting seeing another Brit's perspective. Currently, I'm in Brazil. As you can see, I'm representing here, but yeah, enough waffling. Let's get into this. Let's go. Lost in the
Hi,
Pond.
my name is Lawrence and I have lived in the Midwest for 13 years. In that time, I've resided in the cities of Anderson, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, Indiana, and Chicago, Illinois. I've also
Right.
spent a lot of time in various other states in the Midwest, and I thought now would be a great time to talk about the reasons that I love living here.
Absolutely. You know what? With that being said, I don't think there's any better person to really speak on this. Perhaps someone who's lived longer, but his resume speaks for itself. He's clearly been in the country for a long time, so I would definitely trust his opinion and what he has to say.
6 of them. I talk
Jeez.
about food a lot on this channel, which, says more about me than it does about you. But even though initially I had a sort of longing for those British foods that I'd left behind when I first moved to the United States, I did
Right.
over time come to appreciate some of the food items that you can get in the Midwest. I mean, who doesn't like a good Chicago deep dish pizza? And actually, on that score,
Never tried it. Never actually tried it. I don't know if it'll be too much different from a normal pizza. The only difference I've seen perhaps is that it has more sauce and more cheese. But I could be completely wrong, please.
I've said this before, I actually prefer the Detroit style. Am I going to get in trouble?
Is that the
Chicago
square?
specializes in other world famous foods like the Chicago style hot dog. Make sure
Jeez.
not to ask for ketchup and do insist on the kryptonite looking green relish. But my experiences aren't all slanted towards Chicago. When I was in St. Louis, I had something called toasted ravioli. It's almost as if the Midwest
Jeez.
likes to take well-known Italian food and just sort of pack on the calories, but it was really nice. And even though it's been a few years, I remember having and enjoying a pork tenderloin sandwich, which you can't live in Indiana if you haven't had one of those. And recently, one of my patrons from Ohio recommended that I try eating a buckeye, which I thought was a person from Ohio, and I didn't fancy getting arrested.
The
But it
hell's
turns
that?
out they're just peanut butter balls dipped in chocolate. So if I'm
Does that originate from that
getting
place, Ohio?
arrested.
Is it
But it
Ohio?
turns out they're just peanut butter.
Sorry, did let me just figure out what you
A
mentioned.
pork tenderloin sandwich, which you can't live in Indiana if you haven't had
Indiana,
one of those.
Ohio?
And recently, one of my patrons
Indiana.
from Ohio recommended that I try eating a
It was Ohio, bloody hell.
buckeye, which I thought was a person from Ohio, and I didn't fancy getting arrested. But it turns out they're just peanut butter balls dipped in chocolate. So if I'm in the mood, that sounds all right.
Yeah, I can see that
Even though
working.
I'm
I
a
like
massive
nuts,
introvert.
peanuts, okay, the food, and chocolate, right? That's it.
I usually do find the good in people after knowing them for 3 years. That's most certainly become true of people in the Midwest. And when I lived in Indiana, people always talked about Hoosier hospitality. And it's true. On the whole, people are really welcoming. I mean, it helps if you have a British accent, but they are nice. And I always wondered, well, what's the reason for this? And I think it's the weather. I think having to put up with just mountains of snow every winter makes people way more patient.
I can
That said,
imagine.
it makes people less patient. And in Chicago,
I can see, yeah, to be fair, I can see a group of people being much more warm due to the weather being always cold because you always got to be snuggy, perhaps indoors, a fireplace if you have one, uh, something along those lines. But I could be reaching incredibly hard there.
it's pretty much the same. People are usually nice to me, although it did take me a while to figure that out. Just today on the way to the barber's, this big chap in a Cubs hat yelled, "What's going on, buddy?" And when I first moved here, it would have been difficult to determine if this was a threat or a greeting. And after this sort of thing happened multiple times, I realized that this is just how Chicagoans speak. I think it's affection disguised as a declaration of war.
Right. The thing is with Chicago, from an outside perspective, let's say I think only if you're like someone who listens to rap music, perhaps you would assume that it's a very dangerous place, and I think it is to an extent, as there are dangerous places all over the globe in probably every single city, right? But yeah, this the stereotype amongst urban people perhaps is that it's a dangerous place, but then him saying that the people are extremely friendly, I think that just goes to show that depending on where you are within a certain location, you have a different interpretation of how the place you are is, right? But very interesting how that yeah, very interesting.
I've said this before. I think before moving to the United States, I didn't have such an appreciation for American history. And you could sort of divide American history into geographic subsets. The eastern portion of America rightly takes a lot of credit because it was settled earlier. The West, just because of expansion. But the Midwest seems to have been that kind of bridge in between. And so a lot of the sort of historical narrative comes out of that fact. You have St. Louis, the gateway to the West. And when I think about that, I think about people like Lewis and Clark. And for my British viewers, that's...
What the hell? Purchased by United States from France. France were there first. Spanish territory. Jeez, dude.
Nothing to do with Superman. And then there's the fact that Abraham Lincoln seems to follow me everywhere. Not literally, he's dead. Even though he was born in Kentucky, I was fortunate enough years ago to visit his boyhood home in Indiana. And just this year, I finally got to visit Springfield, where, of course, he was a legislator. And I can say unreservedly that the Lincoln Museum in Springfield is one of the best museums I've ever visited, and it gave me a newfound appreciation for the 16th US president. And then I'm fascinated, perhaps because of my own story, of the people that came here to populate the places in the Midwest. A lot of people in the Midwest are of German ancestry, and I fit in really well, having absolutely no Germanic background, but also a decent contingent of Scandinavian influence. And, you know, I think maybe that accounts for why people can handle the snow quite well.
Perhaps. You know, Jeez, that was actually really informative, mate. Bloody hell. I was definitely locked in. He didn't obviously elaborate too much, but I suppose a brief history lesson there was Abraham Lincoln is from Indiana. Is that the case? Is that the case? Did I just butcher that and forget? Wait, hold on.
In Springfield is one of the best populate the places in the Midwest. A lot of people in the Midwest are of German ancestry, and I fit in really well, having absolute...
Hold on.
Kentucky, I was fortunate enough years ago to visit his boyhood home in Indiana.
And yes, Indiana.
You know, I get messages all the time from people looking to move to the United States and asking me, how much does it cost to live in the US? And my answer is always the same. It really depends on where you're looking to move to. But it seems to me that the cost of living in the Midwest is significantly more in your favor than that of much of the West and East Coast. For example, I rented 3 properties in the state of Indiana, and never once did I pay more than $600. This is practically unheard of in Chicago, and most certainly unheard of in the big cities on the West Coast and the East Coast, where $600 gets you a shed with no roof. And it's other things, you know, little things like the cost.
That is also the case. I mean, obviously in London, but even the outskirts of London, let's say we're looking at Colchester sides, for around £600, which I believe is slightly more to the dollar, perhaps, like let's say $650. That's a room. That's a shared room, bro. That's crazy. That's very encouraging to hear, actually. 600. I'm not sure if it will still be the same. When was this released? This was 2 years ago. That's still pretty decent. That's post 2020.
The cost of parking, for example. In the more expensive parts of the United States, it might cost in multiple dollars just to use a parking meter for an hour. In Fort Wayne, I think we paid something like 25 or 50 cents. Now, the West and the East Coast do attract British immigrants just because they have major hubs. And I wouldn't want to deny anybody that, but living in the Midwest has certainly been kinder, I think, on my wallet than had I chosen to live in, say, New York City. The same is even true for Chicago. While the cost of living here is definitely more expensive than, say, Indianapolis, your money does go a lot further than if you're living in San Francisco. The trade-off being that you have to put up with 400 billion inches of snow every winter. Ofta.
I suppose that, that is also something to put into consideration, isn't it? Could I do it, live in a cold environment? I suppose I've lived in England pretty much all my life, right? And it's not commonly known for being the sunniest of places, but consistent snow on that scale to where it's coming up near your knees, could I deal with it? I don't know. But the prices of the houses, if they're still that good, it's worth looking into, especially if I'm looking to have a family. But as a single person, I suppose it's one of those things, isn't it? You have to really think about. But it's nice to know that it's reasonable in regards to the cost of living, though.
Having grown up not far from the English seaside, I've always enjoyed living near to big bodies of water. And as somebody who didn't move to America's traditional coasts, it is nice to live just 10 minutes away from Lake Michigan because it gives the appearance of a huge ocean just without all of that iceberg malarkey. And I wonder if a lot of people don't think about that when you're in Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, you know, you're never too far away from the sound of seagulls, even if they're stealing your Dippin' Dots. And of course, that's just Lake Michigan. 4 of the Great Lakes are connected to the Midwest. And the state of Michigan is being a little bit greedy. If the tectonic plates shift wildly enough, it won't think twice about devouring Ontario. I just said all of that out loud.
He did,
For me,
mate.
one of the most underrated things about the Midwest is its sunsets. There's a kind of hue in the sky that I don't think I've seen replicated elsewhere.
I would say even myself living in Rio at the moment, the sunsets are incredibly beautiful, man. And I think this is something that would definitely attract me, because even just going out, going on a cliff or on the beach and then seeing the sun go down is beautiful. It's one of those things I think everyone to an extent can appreciate. You know, you might not like go outside with the purpose of looking at a sunset, but when you do look at a sunset, you're like, you know what? It's pretty sweet, you know?
It possibly helps that the Midwest is quite flat, so your vantage point is always pretty strong. That
Right.
vantage point, by the way, for me, has often been over cornfields or soy fields, but it hasn't diminished the experience. In fact, it was on that same Route 66 Illinois trip that I had a kind of wow moment that sounded less cheesy in my head. We were staying in this little village called Sherman, Illinois, and I just wanted some evening B-roll to close out the subsequent video. And I lament to this day that I didn't have a sufficient lens yet to do this sunset justice. And I just wanted to say good night to everybody, except the mosquitoes. The only thing that could improve it is to be able to watch the sunset over Lake Michigan, as I'm sure people in Michigan get to do on a frequent basis.
Right.
I'm not envious at all. And I know what you're thinking, Lawrence, wouldn't you get that same effect with a sunrise? I'm never up before 10:30, so no. Anyway, those are just some of the things I love about living in the Midwest. Let me know in the comments below if you live here.
Right, yeah. So definitely check out Lost in the Pond. He obviously has a big channel, and for good reasons. Very informative. And after having watched this, would I say that I'm truly inspired to move to the Midwest? I don't think that was the purpose. The purpose really was just to tell you what he likes about it. But myself, with it being so cold and me not being the biggest fan of such weather, no, I would not be looking to visit the Midwest, but it definitely seems very beautiful. And for the people that do live there, I'm sure they love it, and for good reason, with the museums, the lakes that have the beautiful sunsets, you know, and the culture, the rich culture that they have. I wish them truly the best, and I hope they enjoy it so much. But yeah, that was 6 reasons he loves living in the Midwest. Pretty good. And also the cost of living. But yeah, you know, very informative. At least now I know in future that this is a place that doesn't suit my personality type, and so I've definitely gained a lot of good information from that. But yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something new. Again, go and subscribe to Lost in the Pond, a very informative video. But yeah, with that being said, catch you guys in the next one. Hope you enjoyed, and